Hi everyone, I'm Dixon from Landsec. Property companies, really good at creating great spaces for people to work. Great spaces for people to visit, to shop, to stay, to live, but not particularly good at measuring carbon and not particularly good at working out the true impact of their activities. And what I wanted to try and give you today in the next kind of 5 minutes is how we're trying to change that. And we think we've made some really good progress with that over the last couple of years. So what is the real impact of what a property company does? So, Landsec, one of the largest commercial property companies in Europe, we operate around 110 properties, and that's huge retail destinations all around the UK. It's prime central London office space, so huge portfolio. And the emissions from that, obviously, you would think would be pretty hefty. But actually, if you do a proper screening exercise and you work out where your carbon emissions really are, well, it turns out they're not in operating this huge portfolio. It's not in the gas, in the Scope 1 emissions. It's all in the supply chain. So our Scope 3 emissions as a business, the stuff that traditionally businesses like ours would not be particularly great at measuring, that's where all the impact is. So this is quite a worrying graph that we put into our annual sustainability report last year. Looking at that in just a little bit more detail, so if we take the Scope 3 emissions, everything in our supply chain and our customers, the emissions that are caused by our activities, but we're not necessarily directly controlling, where are those emissions and where are they coming from? Well, the dark pink here, capital goods, 45%, that's construction. So when we build as a business, we go out and we employ someone like Mace or Skanska or a big contractor to go out and build a building for us. Year on year, if we're busy and we're doing lots of construction, it's about half of our emissions. The year that we're talking about here, 16, 17, our development pipeline was probably coming to a bit of a close. So actually, if you think about where we could be in a few years with lots and lots of projects in London, around the UK being built out, this 45% here is going to start to look a little bit more like 80% or 90%. So big point here, a lot of property companies aren't measuring this, so they're not aware of the fact that most of their emissions, half in a relatively busy year, lots more than that in a very busy year when they're doing a lot of construction, it's all in the supply chain. So that needs to change. So what are we doing? Well, we committed last year to a science-based carbon target. And what that means is that we're committed to reducing our operational emissions year on year, but we're also committed to tackling Scope 3 emissions. And that needs to be, pretty sort of, we need to take a bit of a tough approach to that because we've got this trajectory that keeps our business within the right amount of emissions reductions every year to prevent the planet from overheating. So the idea behind science-based targets is if everyone gets on top of this, and lots of other property companies are starting to take on science-based targets now, then the sector will be on track to prevent the planet from overheating. And science-based targets are getting a huge amount of traction now. So we had our target agreed, and we started to think, well, how are we actually going to start to reduce these emissions year on year? Now, just to frame it slightly differently about the impact of what we do in development, the pollution that's created in the supply chain through our construction activities, whether that's manufacturing aluminium abroad or whether that's factories or raw material extraction in Australia like Simon was talking about before, it has a social cost. So in economic terms, we call it a social cost. Pollution is a social cost. We're creating emissions that have an impact on the planet. But what is the size of that social cost compared to our normal emissions every year? Well, it's pretty big. So this is the year before, 2014 to 16, and this is our emissions as a business. So it's Scope 1, 2, and 3. And if we start to add in individual buildings to this graph, then we get an idea of the impact, the social cost of development. So typical year for Landsec, we would probably have about 120,000 tonnes of emissions. But if you count in just one of our development projects, Westgate, and another, Nova, one of our commercial projects in central London, these numbers are starting to look slightly skewed. So 120,000 tons a year, okay, well that doesn't look too bad. One single project, 139,000 tons. Another project, 195,000 tons. So we can see here from an individual building perspective, the social cost of building those buildings compared to our emissions as a business every year. So this is really, really significant. So what are we actually doing? Well, we've put together a new sustainability brief, which we use to brief our designers. So we use this brief as a document to say to architects, engineers, structural engineers, guys, here's what's important in our sustainability program. And just going straight into the detail on carbon from there. And you might be able to get a copy of these slides after, yeah, but this is on our website as well. So this is the carbon section where we talk about carbon in the supply chain. So we're doing a few things. A, we're flagging that we have this science-based carbon target, which means that we want to reduce our emissions each year. B, we're providing some rule of thumb guidance to our designers. Please do this stuff, don't do this stuff, nice and simple. So, you know, what we want, high recycled content, you know, cement replacement, renewable materials like timber, simple stuff. What we don't want, crude oil derived products, steel produced in traditional furnaces. It's pretty simple. So we provide simple do's and don'ts. And then we have two targets, or how we'll measure success. One is about intensity. So the intensity of supply chain emissions, which is stages A1 to A5 from Simon's presentation before, measured with a benchmark for our commercial buildings and our retail buildings. And then we have a reduction target, which is really incentivizing those right behaviors from our design and build contractors when they're going out and building our projects. So what we're hoping by doing all of this is that we'll encourage our teams, our delivery partners, A, to design the right buildings in the first place so that we get the right level of intensity, and then B, that we'll encourage our contractors and our delivery partners to reduce the emissions by making changes to the contractor's design portion as it's developing. So this approach, we're hoping, will start to really crack the problem that we've got. What have we learned? So we've taken this approach on a few projects in the past. This is Westgate, which is a retail destination in Oxford. Huge project. You know, it's pretty much an entire city quarter right in the center of Oxford. And I think what we learned through this project is that carbon needs to be a material selection exercise. It's not just about measurement. It's not just about getting the measurements exactly right. That's a good thing to do, but it's also about great design. It's about coming up with material selections and methods of construction that reduce the intensity of that building. So, you know, there's lots of features about with Westgate, lots of off-site manufacturing, lots of materials sourced locally, high recycled content, simple stuff that brings down the intensity of the design of the building. And I think what we've learned through this project is that you you need to consider embodied carbon, life cycle analysis, whole life carbon, to be a design exercise primarily. This is about great design for great buildings. What's the future? So on our books at the moment, we've got a few commercial projects in central London that we're looking at. This is one example. This is the famous Piccadilly lights here, and we have an island site behind there which had outline planning permission. And what we're trying to do for these sorts of projects is really build up the role of the embodied carbon consultant. So they're taking on more, quite simply. So they're taking on more of the BREEAM assessment, the bits of materials in BREEAM which double up with some of the embodied carbon stuff, taking a more active role. And they're really being a central member of the design team, influencing the rest of the team and driving the project forward, helping to make those material choices, helping to push the project towards this low carbon intensity. And then more long term, and this is another building that's going through design at the moment, 21 Moorfields, which is a pre-let with Deutsche Bank. Huge, very significant project, really for us, but also for the City of London. And on this project, what we're really trying to do is leverage building information modeling and the technology that's available to us to make the whole process of carbon measurement and counting throughout the design a lot easier and a lot more automated, a lot quicker. So reducing those kind of back office functions of needing to go through spreadsheets and cost plans and extracting in the information and getting the designers to do that work up front. That's it from me, but what I really wanted to get across is that we're trying to consider embodied carbon life cycle analysis to be a design exercise.